Thank you very much for reading. Please look one last time at verse 58. If you've been here for 3 weeks, we've been doing this every single week as we begin. Verse 58 asks, why bother? Why bother? That is the whole 1 Corinthians 15 question. Why bother with being a Christian? Verse 58, you'll see, calls it work and labour. I wonder, had you noticed that being a Christian is hard? Well, the Corinthians, they hadn't. The Corinthians were all about being great, being the most spiritual and getting noticed. And last week we worked through a section of the chapter and we applied it to our morals and to our martyrdom. Then tonight is more mundane, but I think just as important. Tonight is how 1 Corinthians applies to hard work. See, most Christian service is hard work, and it looks very unimpressive. If you were to read through the whole book, chapters 1 to 4, talking about Paul's own Bible teaching ministry, he says it's like being an agricultural labourer. In fact, no, it's like being a slave. Or in chapters 8 to 10, Paul asks all of us to give up any of our freedoms if they would benefit another Christian. His examples: give up eating meat and give up your salary if it would serve the gospel. Chapters 12 to 14 are about any ability that God may have given you and how you are to only use them for the benefit of other people. And then chapter 16 is about how to use your money to love other Christians. Work and labour. Why bother? And on our first Sunday, we said you should bother because Jesus really rose. And then last week we said that means that you will certainly rise. And tonight we're going to add just one more step. You will certainly rise with better bodies. So look down at verse 35 where our reading began. And it is only at verse 35 that Paul gets to their main objection to resurrection bodies. They don't like the idea of resurrection bodies. This is why. Verse 35, how are the dead raised? With what kind of body do they come? So our first heading tonight, his answer to that, they come with better bodies, verses 35 to 49. And he answers by pointing to Jesus. He says, we are going to have bodies like Jesus. See, verse 35, it looks like a really good question. I don't know if it's one that you had before tonight, but Paul says that dead bodies get up out of their graves and begin to live again. And so if they've got bodies, presumably they have teeth and hair and toenails. And I don't know if you can hear the mockery behind verse 35. So, okay, go on then, Paul. What kind of bodies? How old will we be? You know, will 6-month-old babies crawl and dribble for eternity? Or are we all going to look like sort of identical Topshop models? What kind of bodies is it going to be? And Paul's answer is that we will have bodies like Jesus's resurrection body. If you look at the end of that section, verse 49, it ends saying exactly what verse 22 said last week. We shall bear the image of the man from heaven. Our new bodies will be the likeness of Jesus, the way that these current bodies are the likeness of Adam. So if you think about some of the resurrection appearances of Jesus that we looked at in the very first week, well, Jesus, he really is Jesus. It is him. He has wounds on his hands. He's the same man talking to the same friends. But there are major differences, and the being dead bit, that is just the beginning. Jesus is now indestructible. He's transformed into a new kind of being alive. He is going to live forever in a body that is glorious and perfect. Now, given they believe in that, is it really so hard to think that we will be changed as well? And we're going to kind of run through his logic quite quickly. There are some headings on the sheets that you were given. First one is I've put about the GCSE science textbook. I hear they've made them harder, so I don't know if that's still right. Verse 36. You foolish person, what you sow does not come to life unless it dies. And what you sow is not the body that is to be, but a bare seed, perhaps of wheat or of some other grain. Okay, his argument is just basic biology. It's about seeds and about plants and how they look different. That's about all the biology you need to understand here. Seeds and plants, they look very different. In fact, they are different. A seed is not really anything at all unless you put it into the ground and it dies and breaks up, and then you get the plants. Verse 42, he says, these bodies, they are really just like seeds compared to the bodies we're going to have. So it is with the resurrection of the dead. It's the same. And the lesson from basic biology is that we are used to a world full of amazing transformations. And it would be crazy to argue backwards from what seeds are like to say, oh, I don't really believe in plants. I don't think there could be plants. So there's a big difference, isn't there, between a seed and one of the huge trees outside the windows behind here. And ever since you first grew cress on soggy blotting paper at school, you've been happy with that biology. Seeds turn into plants. And the God who invented the science that takes a tiny seed and makes a 70-foot tree, he is able to take your dead body and make something very, very different. Verse 42, so it will be with the resurrection of the dead. The body that is sown is perishable. In other words, you're right. It is stupid to think of bodies like these living forever. That's ridiculous. It's just as stupid as to think you could hang tinsel and baubles on a fir cone. No, what you do is you sow a body like this, and it dies. And the Creator, God, raises a body that is imperishable, just like Jesus' body. He had an old body and a new body. They're related. You can see the marks on his hands. Fir trees are related to the seeds that they came from, but Jesus' body is very, very different. And while he has the GCSE book open, he points to the next page. They're not just different, but also they're in the right place. So he says, sort of, look at everything that God made, verses 39 to 41. It's like a recap, actually, of Genesis chapter 1. God made humans and animals and birds and fish, and also verse 41, he made sun and moon and stars. And the point is, they are all different. And God knows that they are different. And he has experience of putting the right thing in the right place. The heavenly things, like stars and planets in verse 40. The Creator knows that they are not earthly things, like ants and frogs. And not once has he got that confused. Not once has he produced a frog in the deep outer reaches of space when he intended to create a star and a black hole. God has never done that to a frog, and he will not do it to you. You would need a very, very different body if all Christians are to be raised. But the God who created everything, he has that in hand. And in fact, the GCSE science textbook needs a new chapter. So if you flick past insects and fish and amphibians and mammals and spiders, who quite rightly, they have no friends, they need their own chapter, and you keep going through your biology book, there should be a chapter titled Jesus, or New Bodies, for new people for the new creation. And I'm not sure really you should try and, I don't know if any of you have kind of physiology lectures or something where you should go and try and get someone to insert a new course in the lecture. But Jesus rose in the real scientific world. That's our first verses in the chapter, verses 1 to 11. He was seen, he was touched, he caused effects that are still echoing around our real physical universe. So if you're to be truly scientific, there should be a chapter on new bodies, on indestructible bodies, on the kind of body that Christians will have. And verses 45 to 49 prove that it will happen by saying again what we said last week. God the Creator, what he is doing is a new creation. He is making a new universe with a new Adam and a new race of people who are going to have bodies like the new Adam. So in verse 45, it's quoting from Genesis 2. It's talking about the moment when Adam became a living being or a living soul. But Jesus, he is beyond that. He's a different sort of Adam. He became a life-giving spirit. So we're at the big exciting moment of the first creation. God has laid out a human shape, a kind of lump of flesh in human shape. He's put it on the ground, and then God leans over and breathes into the nostrils. And Adam lived. Adam became a living being, a living soul. That's the big moment. If you're a human being, that's where it all began. Well, verse 45 says there has been a sequel. There was a second moment when a something became a new thing. It was this time Jesus' body laid out on the ground. And God acted there as well, and he didn't just put Jesus back to what he was before. No, the resurrection does far, far more than that. The resurrection makes big changes to Jesus, the man. See, Jesus is now spirit, where Adam was soul. Jesus can now give out life to all those who are in him. He's different from Adam, as different as earth and dust are from heaven. And verse 49, just like every human being has borne the likeness of Adam, so every Christian in the new creation will bear the likeness of Jesus, because new creation equals new Adam equals new bodies. And if that's the logic, the emotional force of these verses is there in the contrasts. I've put them in a sort of box on the sheet. That would be the content of your new chapter in the biology textbook. What is this new body going to be like? And the contrasts work off what Greek culture knew. Greek culture despised bodies. Bodies are weak and falling apart and dishonorable. And in some way, we are not as advanced as Greek culture was. We think our bodies are pretty special, and we like them quite a lot. But Paul says, yeah, you're right. These bodies, they are weak and falling apart and dishonorable. But God's answer to that in the future is not to go for something less physical, something that will be all about clouds and shining lights and floating. God's answer is something more physical. That's what the future is going to be. So look at the contrast being made. Maybe take the third one down. It says, this body is sown in weakness, but it will be raised in power. I don't know if this is one that works particularly for the men who've come here straight from the gym, but if you are aiming for those sort of men's health pictures where the men have muscles on top of muscles that the rest of us don't have at all, even those people are weaklings compared to the body that Christians are going to get in the new creation. Do you remember we said last week that you don't only live once, you live twice? And I wonder if you went home imagining, a lot like this one, here's my body now, here's the body I'll have in the future, that'll be great. No, you don't only live once, you live twice, and it will be with better bodies the second time. Bodies that make the most powerful person now look like a weakling. Do you see the huge extra step in Paul's argument this week? It means that of the two lives, of the two bodies that you have available, this one is the spare. See, that would make a difference. There's no comparison between this body and the body in the future. It makes this one the spare. Some of you know that over the summer I've been away on a big kayaking expedition. I spent a month sort of sleeping on sand dunes and living rough and growing a disturbingly grey beard. And as I went round, I took with me two phones. Okay, I took two phones. That was a safety-conscious thing to do. I took this one and this one. Okay, this one is my normal phone in London. It runs my email and my calendar. It has apps for Facebook and for Skype. It has a 6-megapixel camera. It takes video at 30 whatever FPS are, and it can store music and films on 22 gigabytes of memory, which was probably all quite impressive about 6 years ago. Okay, that's this phone and what that does. And then I took this one as well, because this one is my spare phone. Okay, it has a tiny screen and no apps at all. It will take photos, but you don't want to see them. And if you want to text anybody, you can't email, but if you want to text somebody, you need to go back to kind of ABC is on key number 2 and DEF is on key number 3. And if you're too young, I'll explain that to you later. Okay? Now, on my trip into saltwater and sand and gale force winds, this phone lived inside 4 different layers of waterproof indestructibility, and it never came out unless I was actually in a cafe, sitting at a table. But my spare phone lived in a bag in my buoyancy aid. And if I needed a weather report or I needed to ring my wife, it didn't matter if I was 5 miles from land. I took it out at sea and just kind of bounced it on my ear while the wind and the waves tried to get me to throw it in the sea. Makes sense, doesn't it? Because this is the spare phone. We said last week, YOLO is a lie. You don't only live once, you live twice. But we need to understand the second time is the far, far better body, which releases us from all the kind of fear and terror about what happens to us in this life. This is your spare life. So why bother with the work and the labor? Why does that make a difference? See, the Corinthians, they stopped bothering because all they're looking forward to in the future is a new soul, not a new body. And that is not right. You are going to have new bodies, and all the things you want for your bodies now, if you miss out on some of them now, that is not in vain. That is not a waste, because you will have better bodies. Be very hard, wouldn't it, to give up any of being young, free and single in London if this life is the only crack at it that you get. But what if this body is just a seed? Just the seed of something far realer to come in the future? Well then, whatever it is you work and labour at, you can keep labouring to tell your colleagues about the gospel. You can keep giving up your freedoms and your free time to serve Jesus. And I think all of us are going to have separate areas where the labour and work of the Lord runs up against things that our body wants now and for this life. I want to give you a couple of examples now in public so that over at Pizza Union you could work on whatever it would be for you. So how about career? How about career, for example? If you only had one life, then I can see why we would want a well-paid career and a nice house and a happy family. Or why you'd want public recognition that your life had been valuable. But if you have two lives, well then you really could spend every day fully to the work of the Lord. And each of us, that'll mean something different, verse 58, but on the Sunday when a bunch of people have arrived to serve us here at St. Helen's, having given up their jobs to have a go at that full time, always abounding might mean that, or a missionary overseas or something like that. I think summer bank holiday weekend is a great weekend to review our career choices. Or how about the way the career you choose affects how fully you can give yourself to the work of the Lord alongside your job, around your job. Everyone's got to eat, everyone's got to work, but how about the particular career you've chosen? At St. Helen's about a decade ago, we got all the Bible study leaders together and we said, are we overworking you? There's a dangerous question, and it is a genuine question. Life is busy in London. And one leader, who I think the others have since tried to throttle, said, we are not being worked hard enough. Said anywhere else, any kind of smaller church, we would be leading a home group and running the youth group and doing all the finances. And he spoke with real authority because he was somebody who had deliberately chosen his job so he could do more ministry, have more time to labour for the Lord. He'd chosen a less good job than he could have had, with less money. He'd missed the odd promotion so that he could give himself fully. Well, you're not going to do that if you have this life reserved for this body. But your body can get the career buzz in the next creation, or house and holiday and hobby. There will be time. But we have this life to spend now. And the question is what we'll spend it doing. Let's look at money. That was career. How about money? Let me tell you about my money hero. Money hero is a man called Mr. Lang, who started the Lang building firm. And my guess is you, like me, you walk past lots of cranes all over London with his name on the side. Mr. Lang, he lived and he died as a Christian. And as the company began to do well, he began making kind of sensible financial decisions. So he bought a house and he made sure that he looked after his family's needs and security. And then he did something that most people don't do. He kind of got a pen and paper and he worked out how much he needed to live on. If he was going to live kind of comfortably and happily, enjoying what God had given him, but also not lavishly and wastefully either. And he did that at quite an early stage in building up his business. And he decided at that point that he was only going to spend that amount on himself for the rest of his life no matter what he earned in the future. And what he decided he'd do, whatever came over that, he would save half of it and then give the other half away. And he was going to keep doing that however much his salary went up. His spending was not going to go up. And a few years later, his business had done quite a lot better. And he found that he now had so much in savings that the income from his savings was enough on its own to hit that number. So you think, is he now going to spend some more? No. From that point, he gave away everything that he made. New bodies means that is not in vain, because you live twice. And you have one life that lasts forever in perfect, glorious bodies, and another life to spend here on whatever it is that matters most to you. So here is Paul's recommendation, point 2. So give yourself fully to the defeat of death, verses 50 to 57. I'll get to what I mean by that in just a second. I want to pause just to underline how shocking this chapter is. I guess you've noticed that. I think it is a radical chapter, using that word very carefully. I have here an article from the papers by an anti-extremism activist. Her name is Hersi Ali. She's a Somalian and was a member of the Muslim Brotherhood. And now she goes around advising governments on how to oppose extremism. And the article I've got here is from a letter she wrote to our Prime Minister a couple of years ago. And she was saying this. She said, there is no point trying to meet with the moderate preachers in order to combat extremism. That's a wasted thing to do. She said, as long as preachers teach that life after death is more important than life before death, they are part of the problem. Which you can see puts 1 Corinthians chapter 15 firmly in the extremist category. She's saying without that change, if you still think life after death is more important than life before death, well, the moderates, they are just extremists with shorter haircuts and calmer voices. That's the only difference. And do you hear the setup that she has arranged there? She says you have normality on one side, which is to care about the here and now. And that is sort of precious and beautiful and noble and moderate and sensible and balanced. Versus you have radical over there, which is to live for the future. And that is unhinged and radical and extreme and hateful. Now, she's right, isn't she, that it makes a big difference whether you think that living for now is more important than living for the future. But her setup is not completely honest. See, normal versus radical, that is not really the choice that faces you as a human being. The choice is really about what you will live for. And labour and work and vain are 3 key words in the chapter. That is a very, very rich Old Testament set of categories for thinking about your life. And in the Old Testament, the vain, wasted life is the life that Hersi Ali is recommending to you. See, the Bible would say the choice is not to be normal or radical. The choice is, will you work for Jesus or will you work for yourself? Will you work for the next life or will you work for now? Which is a choice between radically eternal or radically temporary or radically selfish. That's the real choice. And vain, wasted, is how the Bible describes this life. From Genesis 3 onwards, or especially in the book of Ecclesiastes, says this life is ultimately vain because it is temporary and passing and empty and cursed. See, the accusation against Paul is that the radical Christian life is the vain life, is the wasted life, which is why these words come up all the way through the chapter. And I hope you'll see how already the chapters help with that. Verses 1 to 49, I think, says it's not vain because of real, better, guaranteed bodies in the future. You have lost nothing. You have another body to come. But verses 50 to 57, I think, takes it one step further. Says, in fact, that the only vanity-free life available to you is a life devoted to the victory over death. Everything else on offer is a waste of your time compared to defeating death. See, verse 58, the therefore verse, it's not really just about helping Christians feel better about missing out on getting drunk. Verse 58 is the answer to the human problem since Genesis chapter 3. The human problem is, what is there that is worth anything? What is there under the sun that isn't empty and temporary? And Paul says, why not work for the victory over death? That's what he means by the work of the Lord. It's actually a very specific phrase. He uses it the same way all the way through the letter as he does in verse 58. I've put the references on the sheet for you. He only uses it to mean the proclamation of the gospel, which that is how any human being in this room can contribute to God's great work of redoing creation and rescuing people from death. So now look down at verses 50 to 57. Verses 50 to 53, they answer one final question about the order of events when Jesus comes back, but actually they are pushing ahead to what the Christian gospel does. So here is what it does. Whether, on the day Jesus comes back, whether you are sleeping in your grave or sleeping at your desk, when Jesus comes back, you will change if you believe in him. You will be transformed. And what will happen, the end of verse 53, this current mortal body will put on immortality. That is what the gospel does. It makes people immortal, which is quite something to say when you're writing to people who live next to Mount Olympus. Okay, they live next to the mountain where they thought the immortals lived. That is actually what the Christian gospel does. That is what any piece of work that you do with the gospel achieves. I always think it must be pretty exciting to be a doctor. Some doctors in the room, I think, particularly when you go to the theatre or when you get on a plane. It must be pretty exciting to be a doctor, mustn't it? I guess you kind of sit there the whole time waiting for that moment when somebody collapses and they say, is there a doctor in the house? I think that must be kind of the highlight of your life. And I was recently on a plane and I was thinking about how cool that would be. The stories you hear about the open heart surgery using only a coat hanger and that sort of thing. And then I thought, I wonder if anybody else on this plane knows how to raise the dead. In other words, I wonder how many other Christians there are on this plane. I might be the only one on this plane who is able to turn somebody into an immortal. So I thought, next time the doctor stands up, I might say, do you mind if I come too? And, just before you do the tracheotomy with the biro or whatever it is you're going to do, would you mind if I tell them about Jesus, assuming they're still conscious? Because if he dies over the North Sea, which seems pretty likely to me, that is going to matter a whole lot more than whether the bit of surgery works. You see, verses 54 to 57 are about the defeat of death. And we said last week that if God wants to win all of time and space, and he does, then what he has to do is defeat death. And the way you defeat death is by resurrecting Christians, by giving Christians bodies again. Verse 54, when the perishable puts on imperishability, then shall come to pass these two amazing Old Testament verses. He goes to an Old Testament passage about God defeating death in the future and a passage about God using death to punish sinners in the past. And he transforms them, says this is the moment. When Jesus comes back and dead people get their immortal bodies, that will be the defeat of death, and the old threat of death will be thrown away. Death is going to be humiliated. So if God wants to defeat death, then the resurrection of Christians is necessary. And if you want to do anything that will last longer than 5 minutes, then you need to be involved in the work of bringing dead people into indestructible life. That's the only work and labour that has value. The only good work, really, unlike any others. Lots of good reasons to go to work on Tuesday. It's nice, isn't it, to have a day when you don't have to tomorrow. Loads of good reasons, loads of value to it in terms of godliness, in terms of feeding yourself and the people you're responsible to. But in 2,000 years' time, no one will care what you did on Tuesday. But if you tell someone the gospel and they live, they will be indestructibly next to you in 20,000 years' time. That is a good work unlike any other. labour and work that lasts forever. Do you know why flags go down to half-mast when someone dies? Do you know why that is? I didn't know this until I looked it up a little while ago. And do you ever wonder why it's not really half-mast at all? Like, I know where half is, and that is not half. The reason is you bring the flag down just enough to fly one other flag above it. And the flag you're flying is the flag of death, the invisible flag of death. It's from the kind of Napoleonic world, the world of master and commander, and you capture an enemy ship, normally a French one if the war is going well, and you run down the French flag just enough to put the British flag over the top. And that says, we've won here, we've captured. So every single human death is a conquest. Is death winning here again? Every time you run down the flag, death sticks his flag over the top. There we go again. I've won, I've won, I've won. And in those kind of films, the Navy films, the best moment is when the smoke clears just for a second and you see a damaged ship that was a British ship and it's got the French flag on it and it's going the wrong way and it's a disaster. And the captain, that's not emotion, that's dust. The captain says, man the boats. And they charge over and they capture the ship. And he says, take that flag down and run the colours back up. And we all cheer. Every human being is under the flag of death and will one day have that flag over them until Jesus, who died and was raised and is now a life-giving spirit. And on the day Jesus comes back, every single dead person who died believing in him is going to be transformed and live forever. And in the sadness of Christians I know who've died, in the sadness there's always the pain of missing somebody, there's always the horror of the kind of mess that gets left behind. But if they're a Christian, there is always also a victory and a hero every single time. The victory over death and the person who told them the gospel. About 2 years ago, I went to a funeral that was about the worst, in human terms, worst funeral I've ever been to. A friend who had died suddenly in her early 30s, leaving behind 2 young kids. And that was very sad. But in the funeral and around it, and as we told the stories, there was also the story of a school teacher who used to come to church here, who, while she was coming to church here, she was a colleague with my friend, my dead friend. And when they were colleagues, she told her the gospel. And I guess that was probably a lot of effort, and it probably took a lot of time and a lot of perseverance. It probably had to overcome a load of fear to do that. But Susan Ho, it's like being a bomb disposal specialist, isn't it? She spoke words that took away sin and death from my friend, who, united to Jesus, is going to rise indestructible. Doesn't that change the way you feel about the labour and the work of evangelism? Let me finish with one exercise that we do with students, and I understand that everyone in the room who's not a student is completely stuck and settled and all your decisions are behind you, but let's see if this would help as well. With students we say, what would be the worst case scenario if you were to live this radically from now on? What if you were to give your life to what really matters, rather than paying off the mortgage and the student loan and keeping your mum happy? So we say, okay, imagine, well, a student maybe could do less well in their exams. They could drop a whole class in their degree, maybe, if they go for too much Jesus and not enough revision. What would that mean? Well, that might mean later on that they don't get quite as good a job as they were going to get. They're in a different job. So let's run that out. Maybe 3 years later, maybe they're earning 10 grand less than they would have been otherwise. And again, wherever you're studying this, maybe you go for being a bit more annoying at work so you don't get promoted, so you're at the same kind of level. There we go. Let's run it forwards. 30 years later, how much might it be? Maybe you're on 100 grand less a year. Much less influential, much less well-known, earning a lot less. How about 50 years' time? Well, 50 years' time, there's going to be a substantial difference in the size of the pension, isn't there? Which means that the student who made the radical decision is going to be playing a lot less golf, or it's going to be raining in the places where they're playing golf. But how about in 100 years' time? or in 1,000 years' time? How about when you are walking around in your new body with your non-Christian friend who believed in Jesus through your hard work and labour? What about then? Here's something I guarantee they will not say to you in the new creation. I guarantee they'll never say, I wish you hadn't spent all that time talking to me about Jesus. You know, I wish you'd made area manager. That would really have been something. Don't you want to labour for the amazing, awesome victory of Jesus over death? Doesn't it make you cheer every time somebody you know becomes a Christian? Because death has lost them. Death, you've got no victory anymore. In fact, verse 58 seems like maybe too little to ask at the end of a chapter like this. The labour, that is not in vain. Let me lead us in prayer. Father God, thank you for your plan in your Son, that through his death, through his resurrection, we would be remade completely, that we would be indestructible and glorious and powerful, far better than we are now, in a new world with you. Father, thank you that in this life now, we have the skills, the time, the abilities, the money that you've given us. And Father, pray that we would spend this life for you, that we would abound fully in the work of the Lord. To your name's sake. Amen.